and they will talk all DeFi and regulation.
So, hello, Paris.com. Thank you for having us. Sorry, it's a logistic problem. Don't move, Ivan. Okay, we're good. So I'm really happy to be there. Thank you for following through the day and being with us now. It's actually an interesting subject and a challenge that we will address now, because we will try to make regulation sexy and to explain and to explore why we should need regulation in DeFi in a trustless world, and how it should look like, or how it could look like. So I have a very nice panel with me today, a very eclectic one. So you're all representing various verticals in the ecosystem and in the industry. So maybe we can start by introducing each of you. Do you want to start, Ivan?
Yes, with pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm working for BPI France, which is the French sovereign fund. We have 50 billion assets under management, and that's why we are heavily regulated at three levels: AMF for the funds management, ACPR for the banking part, and European Central Bank, because we pose a systemic risk.
Thomas, you want to go?
Yes, so for my part, I'm working for Bifrost Finance. We are a liquid staking protocol. And for my part, I also worked previously in the traditional finance for like 15 years. So I know a lot about regulation in the traditional finance too.
So hi, I'm ALEXEI. I'm one of the co-founders of Interlay. We come from the Bitcoin corner, so we've been working for the last 8 years from research to practice on unlocking more features for Bitcoin. From DeFi, DAOs, to whatever else we can build.
And I'm Primavera. I guess I represent the academic vertical. I'm a legal scholar at the CNRS and at Harvard, and my research is mostly trying to identify the legal challenges and opportunities that blockchain technology provides.
I am Sébastien Dupont, the CEO and founder of Archetic, a blockchain trying to solve the problem of the mass adoption, and by providing some biometrics part. So we're quite involved inside the regulation aspect. Yeah.
I'm Ube. I'm co-founder of Convergence RFQ. It's a request for quote network for institutional block trades for spot perpetual swaps. We're currently looking into offering RWA assets or instruments, and yeah, very well connected in been I guess in the fintech industry for the past 14 years. Yeah, so about it.
Thank you all. So we really have a sample of the ecosystem. Someone that's more into funding, VCs, or that represents that. Two DeFi protocol. One researcher, let's say at the front of the regulation. L1, we can call Archetic L1, and a decentralized bank. That's it?
It's a decentralized request for quote network. So think of it like a paradigm RFQ, which is a request.
Can you put the microphone there,
yeah.
please? Thanks.
Yeah. So think of us like a paradigm RFQ, which is a request for quote network for Deribit, which is an options exchange, but fully decentralized. So the risk engine and the matching engine are fully on-chain. And one of the primary reasons why we designed it this way is to be fully non-custodial, right? In a post-FTX world where institutions trust less one another, we become an alternative to an ISTA agreement with free counterparty risk.
Yeah, thank you. And for me, I'm the co-founder of Kamea Labs, which is a regulated asset manager that's also using non-custodial solution. So we are living in the post-FTX world, and we're trying to offer an entry point to crypto that doesn't require you to go through a centralized exchange. And obviously we're regulated too, so we had to do some weird stuff. You would not know. You don't want to know. So before starting this panel, I guess we could talk about the SEC versus Ripple development that recently happened, because I do think it's changing a lot for us, and especially for everything related to secondary market, DeFi protocol, and collateralization. So maybe Primavera, you have something to say about that?
Yes.
Maybe you can sum up what happened first.
Yeah, so I spent a few nights ago just reading this thing. So basically, I would say like it's a very interesting decision. So the SEC has provided some partial, I guess, partial victory for now for Ripple to the extent that the token, a token that is sold on an exchange then will not necessarily qualify as a securities. I found the decision very interesting. I also, so from digging into the actual wording of the decision, it's an important precedent, I think, in terms of like, well, of Sudan, if you have something that does not obviously qualify as a security and that does have some kind of utility to it, exchange on the secondary market through exchanges is something that we might be less worried about. To me, the challenge is there is still some very substantial uncertainty to the extent of like how do you know whether the token does clearly qualify as a security or is in this gray zone in which it could be a security, it could be a utility, it could be both. And to some extent, great, let's trade them on exchanges so that we don't have to worry. But if a judgment then were to say, well, actually, this token was obviously a security to begin with, then you don't get the protection, right? And to me, this is interesting. I think that's great that utility tokens that are obviously not security or that are on this kind of like gray area can be protected from the fact of being exchanged on secondary exchanges. But I don't think it completely eliminates the uncertainty because there is, unless you get like some kind of like statement beforehand that the token is to be seen not as a security, it still creates this very dangerous gray zone in which retrospectively a judge might say, well, actually, it was a security token, and therefore you don't benefit from the protection.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone has anything to say about that, maybe?
I think it opens the door for alt season, right? And pretty much anything that has a fair launch process becomes less of a security, I guess, from the US jurisdiction perspective. The problem right now is that every single jurisdiction has a different interpretation, and every single department within the US has a different interpretation of what is security or a commodity, right? So I think it's a nice first step towards coalescing that interpretation, but yeah, I think it still has a long way to go, I guess.
Yeah, it was weird. So basically, selling XRP token in the private market was selling a security, or at least the saved contract was a security, but the underlying asset was not. But what's the real utility of XRP? That's the real question. But thanks for that. I think we would need an entire panel to talk about that, but that was not the subject. So let's dive into the subject, even if it's quite close. So basically, regulators have issue with Web3. And at first, they didn't know how to handle them. You said it, the CFTC and the SEC are fighting to see who should be regulating them. So it's a shady area. We don't really know. But there is some interesting lead. And for example, the SEC stating that Bitcoin is decentralized. So Bitcoin can't be regulated, basically, or it can't be a security, or no one can be liable for Bitcoin. And recently, the French regulators also released reports about DeFi protocol that was basically saying, okay, if a protocol is decentralized, then yeah, it posed the question, how you should regulate a decentralized protocol, who is liable for that? And on the other side, DeFi protocol and L1 will need to be compliant with the law of the society if we want to put DeFi at the service of the real economy. So it asks an interesting question that we will address today. And this question is basically how you could regulate DeFi while protecting the Web3 values, and how to do that in a smart way, and to basically front-run the regulators to be sure that the rules that we will apply comply with us too. So maybe the first question would be, what does regulating DeFi means, actually? Maybe, Yvan, you want to say something, because you must know the AML law and all that stuff. And so what it would mean if we would apply the current regulatory framework to a DeFi protocol?
Okay, so first things first, these opinions are very personal. It gives you an overview of the importance of regulation. It's a very good question, because the great thing about Web3 is that this is the technical first, and regulators are writing laws. And some regulators are very clever because they clearly understand that they need to reinterpret the law. We don't say that laws are not the right media. It's just that this technical kind of intrinsically.
You mean the issue is that we can't apply the law that we have right now to DeFi protocol?
Yes.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they have kind of frameworks, because there was no regulation 40 years ago. I mean, it began with, in Europe, with MIF. It was a very simple version, and then the crisis of 2001 and 2008 brought regulation. And all the AML laws are pretty recent if you watch the history of law. So they are quite obsessed with these things, and they want to apply it to DeFi, to Web3, and you have kind of a square and circle problem. Like it's not clicking that well. The good news is that the technical capacities of blockchain can bring amazing efficiency to regulators, but for this you need to have the possibility to take this into account. And for the moment, the only regulator that was kind of okay with that was Malta, and then they completely withdrawn their views. So we have to find kind of a way. I think the regulators should be more technical. The technical agnosticity is something very hard to deal with within such technical environment. And on the other hand, the DeFi space must also pave the way, doing some more legal stuff. I mean, except to register and stuff. And the truth is always between these two worlds.
Does someone want to add something about that? Yeah, go on.
I mean, so coming from the other perspective. So I mean, as a DeFi protocol, like, at least how we've considered it, I think it's not that you don't want to register, it's just that there was no regulation. It was like unclear, what are you? What happens if no one controls the protocol, it's decentralized? And of course, and it was often seen as a like, okay, well, we'll just go decentralized and then, you know, it's not regulated. But I do think it's important to actually, you know, figure out ways, okay, well, what actually are we regulating? So the UK, for example, has been looking to consider regulating the interfaces, which kind of makes sense, right? Interface, somebody arguably controls the website, right? So whoever controls the interface should be regulated because they're providing access to the underlying protocol. But I think it's like, that's probably an interesting approach that can be taken. You'll have tons of loopholes of people just, you know, hosting interfaces, or like then you have IPFS distributed storage where somebody can, you know, go around that way. But I do think, you know, and then now speaking as a business, right, registered in the UK, right, you know, we cannot use DeFi. And, you know, coming from that perspective, you're actually excluding a big market, many people who, you know, cannot use these protocols. They cannot benefit from the transparency and improved security because it's not regulated and they don't want to, exit the system. And I think, in the Bitcoin community, and I think in a lot of also Ethereum community, this, everybody will just switch and exit the system. I think that is if that's not the right approach. I think it needs to be a gradual movement towards, okay, we've built a decentralized stack. Now let's find a way to allow people to use it while still being compliant with laws, but of course also challenging current laws to see, well, does it actually apply? Are these the right tools to, actually regulate these protocols?
Yeah, I think you pointed something interesting in that the regulation is basically asking the service provider to comply with the law. And the issue with DeFi is that there is no service provider. And the fact that the front end or the interface would actually be the bridge between the user and the protocol, and being the service provider, and should be in charge of the AML. You want to say something?
Yes. The classical regulation that we know currently on the traditional finance, the regulation is mostly based on third parties. And in DeFi, you don't have these third parties. So the regulator doesn't have any the known regulatory entry points that you usually know. So in DeFi, how do you regulate it? Does it have to be bear by the users, which are the end users, or does it have to be bear by the smart protocols? So that's a question, and I think currently that's really foggy, and no one really knows how to do it. But
at the same time, a lot of DeFi protocols have to comply, like DYDX, or even myself, when I co-founded DeFi Option Vault, we had to KYC all of the market makers bidding on the volatility of these deposits during these auctions. DeFi Option Vault, for those of you who don't know, is pretty much a way for users to generate natural yield based off the volatility of their deposits, as opposed to Ponzinomics or an inflationary token emission being given back a random governance token. So the vault writes option strategies, and it's usually hedge funds or market makers in search of volatility arbitrage opportunities trying to buy these instruments. And so there are several DeFi option vaults out there, protocols that conduct KYC on these hedge funds, right? They have to make sure they're not transacting with OFAC sanctioned addresses. And even ourselves as an RFQ, some of our users prefer us to do analysis or do KYC, QAB assessments on these institutions. I see tools like chain analysis gaining massive mainstream institutional adoption. And I was on a workshop in New York just last week, and it's surprising to me that they're looking at transactions from Silk Road times 10 years ago. So yeah, I feel like there will be a lot of demand for compliance for DeFi protocols, even if it's not at the protocol itself, on the front end, like in DYDX's case, or Uniswap's.
Yeah, I will just tell you a story. So the first time I met AMF, so they asked me the total supply.
The AMF is a French regulator.
Yeah. So they asked me the total supply. And I think that kind of question is just the graal of the meaning of the regulation on it. So because of course, if you have you can dilute the investors, so that question is really key. So there is the math, and of course there is some technical needs inside regulation just to have a good solution at the end. There is also understanding of what is really decentralization. If tomorrow Bitcoin is going to be hosted only in China or whatever the country, at the end the meaning is a bit different. And also, just basic rules can be applied to anyone, like total supply. So I think if we have to sum up something, it should be great to do it like that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I just have a little provocation. It feels to me like the regulating DeFi today is actually regulating CeFi for like two reasons. One is because the way in which regulation is trying to achieve the regulation of DeFi is actually by pushing towards a re-centralization or identifying intermediaries or actually recreating intermediaries so that they can be more easily regulated. The other one, which I think is even more like tedious, is that a lot, like of course, KYC, AML, etc., is slightly different, but there is also a lot of a regulation that is born because of centralized finance, because of counterparty risk, because of all those reasons that a centralized financial institution needs to be regulated, because there are a lot of trust within those institutions, and somehow we created those regulations because of the centralized institution, and now it's about like, how do we transpose those regulations that were designed to prevent a centralized institution from abusing its power into a decentralized ecosystem in which the counterparty risk is not there, and there is obviously other risk, but then maybe let's think about what are the risks of DeFi and let's regulate the DeFi risk instead of taking an existing regulation that was designed for a completely different setting and trying to transpose it.
Thank you for the transition. so regulating DeFi is actually not possible, and maybe we could quickly ask ourselves, why even try to regulate DeFi? But we almost answered that already, but maybe someone wants to add something on that. What would be the benefits for DeFi protocol to be regulated?
I think like protocols like Aave or Compound Finance have tried to establish, for example, Aave Arc, governance processes to allow for institutions to adopt that technology. It's one of the reasons why Project Guardian from JP Morgan weren't able to use Uniswap for just simple forex swaps. They had to use Aave because of that ARC permission framework.
So on my side, I'm the CEO Layer 1. And the problem is without a good regulation, so I think just something to tell you're not someone trying to fraud something, or regulation can be helpful. To be honest, today it's not clearly defined, and we have to prove everywhere, every time the same thing. So yeah, in terms of if we want to be a leader on that area, that part must be clearly defined somewhere.
Perhaps think of it this way. So someone wrote the code for a DeFi protocol, and there must be rules, right? What is allowed, what isn't allowed. So sure, code might be like, code is lies, that's something that we all like to say. But what is to say that this code is actually doing things that are okay and ethical, right? So yes, if it's just an exchange of assets, I swap one token for the other, there's no custody, nobody can steal my funds, and I've guaranteed like execution, the counterparty cannot run away, that's good. But what if it's not doing that? What if it's some more, and like as we get into more sophisticated products, we see more of like things like Luna, right? Which are, where there's red flags all over it. Is that okay? What is it? Like, and then we get into all these like Ponzi schemes and like things that are clearly not okay. And I think like having a rule book of, just applying what is allowed and what isn't allowed, which is clearly like an illegal activity or trying to defraud people, that should be forbidden. But, do we need regulations for that? I don't know. It's like, you can probably, get an idea pretty quickly if it's defrauding or not. But as things get more complicated, I think having a rule book of, okay, you're building a DeFi protocol. First of all, like, when are you decentralized? Because honestly, 99% of DeFi is not decentralized. If I have the admin keys and I can just, flick a switch and I've changed the contract, maybe I should be regulated because yes, there's a contract and in theory, as long as nobody touches it, everything's fine. But I can come along and, just turn it off or whatever. So I think there needs to be a definition of, okay, when is it decentralized? And then if it's not, then you're okay, you just have to abide to the laws and like, follow the regulations as if you're a centralized entity. And then it's good because you get rid of all the C DeFi, which caused a lot of damage. But then if you're really decentralized, there still should be rules. Okay, like if you're not sure, right? Maybe some people have difficulties of identifying what's ethical, what's not, but having a guide, okay, doing a swap where there's no custodian, okay, that's okay perhaps, right? But how are you allowed to market that? Are you allowed to go out to people and say, oh, this is a decentralized protocol, but you'll make a lot of money if you put it into there. So I think it's dangerous to hide behind this decentralization kind of argument. It's necessary today, but I do think we would all welcome if there was more clarity on, okay, this is what we can do, but how do we communicate this to people? Like, and if it may, perhaps there might be a rule that, okay, if I want to market it, then I need to obtain certain licenses and I need to actually, obtain certain checks that I actually abide by this. And if I don't market it, well, then sure, maybe then it's not as strict.
Yeah, that's the issue, that the regulation, it's touching many kind of markets. Because you were talking about private markets and public offerings, but there is also just financial law and bank laws, and basically how to avoid benefiting the Lazarus group through decentralization thanks to pools and stuff like that. Thomas, you wanted to add something?
Yes, also to emphasize what just Alexei said, is that for the why does it need to be regulated, I think the main answer is to protect the users, to protect the end users. Because currently, DeFi is like Western, so everyone can come and is trying to rob you money. Some protocols are the oldest one now, they are pretty safe. They are pretty safe, so we know the code is pretty robust. If you go there, you're pretty safe. But if you're going to other protocols, you don't really know. They can say the smart contract is doing something, but it's doing another thing, so you don't really know. And the base user won't go deep into the code to check if this is doing what is told to, what is told to be done. So, and if we are all looking for mass adoption, we need to protect the users in the end.
That's what I was about to conclude. It's a matter of adoption in the end. Like if you want to serve the economy and the society, we somehow need to follow what the society votes for or not. Maybe you have a point of view from the funding side. Like, I have the feeling there was a shift in the Web3 market, and like 2 years ago, the projects were advertised and marketed in a way, and since the Luna crash, FTX, the recent SEC trials with Coinbase and Binance, I have the feeling that VCs are not investing in Web3 anymore, and that regulation is actually a matter of survival for projects. Do you feel that in the VCs sectors?
Okay, you have. We would kind of do the difference between the VCs. You have some VCs that kind of are really followers, and these are exactly these guys. Web3, bull run, I invest, bear market, I don't talk about crypto anymore, forget about me. I don't think it's the right attitude, but they have their issues. And then you have kind of more Web3 implied VC, really what we call crypto natives. And these guys are still on the ground, and we are all trying to find a solution. Where I am more and more skeptical is that if we try to apply the regulatory framework from traditional finance, as Primavera was speaking about, it won't work. It's just not adapted. No matter how hard you try, no matter how long the text is, it won't work. So there is an opportunity to rethink about it. Otherwise, it will be a little bit like TradFi. There is a scandal and a regulation. We all remember Enron, because when I was a trainee in audit, I was doing photocopy all day, and I didn't understand why. And it was because of Enron, because of then the Sarbanes-Oxley law, and then the audit firm where I had extra jobs and were invoicing extra fees. And we have a great opportunity to rethink some stuff, and DeFi can bring more information on the table, more trust. And this is the great opportunity. I hope regulation will take it. The good news is that there is not only one worldwide regulator. Of course, there is FATCA, OECD, but there is a regulatory arbitrage right now between the different regulation, and there is a kind of a competition, and that's good. And if one regulator finds a good idea to regulate DeFi, as you mentioned, it's super hard. I don't have the pretension to have the good ideas, but we can make steps, and then the regulators can take this good idea and try to improve the system. It will take time. But if you hire the same lawyers to regulate DeFi, it wouldn't work. So it's a great challenge.
So it's like states have to get some competitiveness to attract DeFi protocol, And at the same time, DeFi protocol need to find a home to be able to safely develop and deploy. And so how do we do that, knowing that it's not possible to regulate DeFi? Maybe Primavera, you can talk to us about regulatory equivalent and the work you're doing about that?
Yeah. So yeah, I think we cannot directly regulate DeFi, but we can actually incentivize regulatory compliance. And so basically there is two regulatory approaches. Either we actually implement extremely harsh and draconian regulation, which will force DeFi to turn into CeFi, or we actually identify the benefits that DeFi can provide if properly designed. And the problem is that today, not every DeFi protocol is actually properly designed. And in fact, many of them, independently of whether they are properly designed, could implement additional technological guarantees for regulatory compliance. So the concept of, so there is this concept of functional equivalence, which is more commonly deployed, for instance, like in the case of like electronic commerce, where you have a new technology, the internet, and then there is an old regulatory framework, like contract law. How do we actually apply existing vocabularies that are part of an old legislation that didn't even know the electronic digital world? Then we can play the game of functional equivalence, which is instead of creating a new body of law that will be specifically for e-commerce, we can actually recognize functional equivalence between a paper document and an electronic document, a digital signature and a qualified signature. And identifying, of course, is not every digital signature will be regarded as a qualified signature, but identifying what are the technological criteria, the boundary condition in order for a particular new technology to be regarded as equivalent to a former technology, so that the law apply equally without having to reform the language. The concept of regulatory equivalence goes one step further, and the idea is that the reason that we have specific regulatory formalities and requirements is because there is a policy objective. Usually it's about accommodating risk. So we need, because, especially in the context of centralized finance, there is like entities that are custodial, that are like, there is a lot of things that happen within those companies that we need to make sure that we need to audit, we need to create guarantees that cannot be provided by a piece of paper. In the case of DeFi, or generally blockchain-based system, there are some guarantees that can be codified directly into the technology. And so the concept of regulatory equivalence is actually to identify that there are different ways, there are different pathways to actually achieve the same regulatory objective. Sometimes a blockchain-based infrastructure can actually be at least equivalent, if not better, than all the infrastructure of formalities and constraints that are implemented in the traditional legal world. And so regulatory equivalence is actually about inviting innovation at the technological level and trying to identify what practitioners are already doing or what practitioners could do that actually reduce the risk and provide some guarantees, and actually recognizing that it is possible to achieve regulatory compliance through those new technological mechanisms, so that then it is up to the regulated entity to choose, will I rather comply in the traditional way, and I'm just going to get all my reports and audits and etc., or do I actually want to adopt a particular technological guarantees which will achieve the same regulatory objective? And in this way, it's not about, no one can impose, no one can say, this is how every single DeFi protocol has to be designed. And you cannot enforce that decision anyhow. However, you can say, well, if you want to have some kind of legal recognition, regulatory compliance, if you want to be seen as a compliant entity, here is the design that you need to adopt. If you adopt it, we're going to recognize you as compliant. If you don't adopt it, you're on the red or gray zone. And so it's kind of this give and give. the regulator needs to give something to those entities which is recognizing the regulatory equivalence in order to incentivize. It's like the carrot as opposed to the stick. Here's the carrot, you want to be legally recognized, and therefore willingly all those actors that do want to actually be compliant, now they know what they have to do in order to be compliant, and the regulator also win because oftentimes those technological guarantees are actually more effective.
Thank you. Do anyone wants to add something to that or react?
Not after that.
I guess so. Like that would be, I think, super interesting and welcome if there's like a blueprint, right? But the challenge, and I guess something that I would challenge, coming from like the DeFi side, and like what was Bitcoin created? Because the laws and the regulations didn't work back then, and actually there's a lot of corruption in many countries in the world where people don't have access to the financial system. So how do we ensure that, by creating a blueprint, we don't end up incentivizing things that perhaps, prevent people from gaining access to financial tools, are very exclusive, and actually don't achieve the goals that we set out to achieve in crypto. So I think definitely that needs to happen. But if we just say, okay, well, you have to KYC everyone and have to AML, and you basically prevent any form of privacy of funds, and you basically also, it works maybe for countries in Europe, but what about the global south? Does it work there? And that's, I think, what would be a very big challenge in this space. Okay, sure, maybe we can get some regulations for people in Europe, right, where most of us hopefully, never experience the challenges of not being able to access a bank, or never having a default, or just banks going bust and our assets not being insured. That might work, but what about everybody else? And I think this is what we're experiencing. We try to build a decentralized system. I think probably you'll have quite the split between countries which, want regulation. They maybe give a blueprint, but then the same technology will be used outside of that country, right? Without these regulations, because, well, it's public. So how do you think this can coexist? Do you think a system can be both regulated in Europe under MiCA, but at the same time used in Latin America without complying with these regulations? How would that work?
So the concept of regulatory equivalence is not a monolithic thing, which is this is how things need to be done. It's actually an invitation because I think the regulator with the best intention, they don't know the space enough to even be able to propose the right technological solution. So I think it's up to practitioners and it's up to the private sector to actually come up with ideas, depending on where they want to operate. Of course, if you want to operate in Europe, you might have to come up with more creative ideas of how do you provide regulatory equivalence in order to comply with the MiCA. If you want to operate in South America or Africa or in other countries, it depends on what are the requirements that you might need to look for compliance for regulatory equivalence for. I think that ideally, and this is huge challenge, but it's such a beautiful challenge that I hope everyone is going to try to solve it, is how to actually, what is the purpose of KYC, right? Why do you need and there is many reasons, right? And so can you identify ways, and maybe KYC is one of the solutions, can you identify other ways in which a technological guarantees is actually providing the solution to the same regulatory objective, right? And I think the blockchain, we are really only at very simple designs right now. You can have some very interesting ex-post verifiability system, etc., where you can actually protect the privacy of actors, and only when and if someone really needs to dig into what's your identity, you can prove, for instance, not to be part of a sanctioned group of address and so forth. So there is a lot of very interesting things like privacy pools and so forth. So technology is actually coming and innovating and actually finding ways in which you can respond to specific risk. I can prove that I'm not part of a sanctioned group without necessarily having to KYC because of cryptography. So there are ways in which at least we can get to a point in which instead of asking the regulator, tell me how do I comply, asking the regulator, what is your policy objective? And now let me tell you how I can comply with that.
So basically it's up to us to understand what the regulators want and to be creative and to find a better solution or maybe a more global one that could please all the regulator, for example? Maybe you want to say something, Sébastien or Uwe?
Yeah, that's a very good aspect. So I think the zero knowledge proof, I don't know if you, that's one of the solutions. So if at the end, your question is just to understand if the person have more than 18 years old, maybe it's not necessary to give your ID, all your privacy data, and maybe it can be done by that kind of protocol, helping the regulator to have that certitude to there is no risk on it. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I think the creation of systems is going to reinforce the identity reuse on blockchain, on any chain. I think one of you brought the point of most of DeFi not being truly decentralized, which is very true. Developers usually, for most contracts, before they fully decentralize, hold the keys to make upgrades to the contract.
Are you talking about FTM, for example?
Sure. Or just general development. A lot of these teams that receive VC funding or institutional funding usually have some centralized component or origin. And as they find product market fit, they have to make upgrades and constant iterations to the contract. They have to hold all the keys. So yes, so there are still several challenges that need to be. Obviously, the no fault, no issue or no fault thesis pursued by MiCA and other regulatory frameworks. Hopefully we'll find some solutions to these challenges.
I agree. That's really exciting, and that's it's a challenge for us. We are reaching the end of the panel. If anyone wants to add something.
To be a little provocative, what's funny is that these regulators have an amazing opportunity to work with DeFi protocols and do stuff. If they don't, people will go offshore.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, or I don't know why, but you can't regulate offshore. When you tell these words to regulators, they're like, oh, it's too complicated. Oh, we can do nothing, blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay, so do something. Otherwise, crypto will reinforce offshore and you will be more and more useless. It's very provocative, but at the end of the day, we have a great opportunity to go out from offshore. If we do nothing, then everybody will be offshore. It's not pleasant, but if that's the only solution, let's do this.
Do you mean that if regulators doesn't act fast, DeFi protocol and layer ones will do like rich people and will go away and we won't get taxed on that?
Yeah, you can legally do this right now. So why wouldn't crypto industry wouldn't do it at some point? We have to ask the right question. So if we can avoid this and show a better version, that would be great. And this is a common objective. So when the high regulators are criticizing crypto, we say we have a common enemy then, offshore.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that could be the word of the end. Do you want to add something to that? I think it's pretty great, Yvan. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to the Paris.com and thank you for listening. It's over. Thanks.
It's over.